So now that we have our game data object that we want to load from JSON, we are going to add a function to our data controller to load game data. So let's put this down at the bottom. Let's just add some white space at the bottom so we can not be stuck up against the bottom. And so we're going to declare a private function that returns void, which will be called load game data. And the first thing that we want to do in load game data is create a path where we're going to look for our data to load. And to do that, we're going to add a private string variable called game data file name, and that's going to be equal to data.json or JSON. So we've got our private game data file name, and now in load game data, we are going to create a string variable called file path, and that's going to be equal to path.combine. Oh, and so I made a mistake here. Path.combine is part of the system.io namespace, which I need to add at the top of my class, right? I skipped a step. So we're going to add using system.io, which is going to give us access to path.combine. And in this case, we are going to combine the path from application.streamingAssets path and our game data file name. And so if you remember, the streaming assets path is this folder here. So we're using the application.streamingAssets path because that path may vary depending on the platform. And we're taking that and combining it with our file name to create the file path at which we're going to look for our data. So once we've created that path, we're going to check if that file exists, and therefore we can load it. So we're going to say if file.exists at file path, then we're going to attempt to load. So the first thing that we need to do is read all the text from the file at the file path into a string as JSON. So we're going to declare a string called data as JSON, and that's going to be equal to file.readAllText from the file path. So we're going to read all the text out of the file that we find and store it in a string called data as JSON. Next, we want to take that string and deserialize it into a game data object. So we want to turn it from text back into an object that we can use in our game. So we are going to declare a game data type variable called loaded data, and we're going to set that to equal JSON utility dot from JSON, and we're going to pass in the type game data. So this is the type that we want to return our data to, right? We want to populate the fields of a game data object with the data from our JSON string. And we're going to the string that we want to turn from JSON back into an object is going to be our string data as JSON, right? So this is kind of at the heart of the matter here. The JSON utility allows us to convert from JSON and to JSON, and we just need to provide it a type of object and a string of data to convert. And then we're storing that in this loaded data variable here. So now we've got our data back into a game data object, and now we're going to make it available to use in the game. So now we're going to say all round data equals loaded data dot all round data, right? So you remember data controller had an all round data variable, and our game data class also had an all round data variable. So now we're just setting our local variable to equal the data from the data that we loaded from the file. Now, it's possible somehow that there is no data there, in which case our game is in a fairly bad situation, and so we want to throw an error. So we're going to say else, meaning this is if file.exists at file path returns false, then we're going to say debug.log error cannot load game data, and there we have it. So now we can save this, and we can set our round data variable from public now to private, because now we're going to be loading the data from the JSON file, and now we are ready to load our game data, so we are going to call that from start. So in start, we're going to load the game data, we're going to load the player progress, and then we're going to load our menu screen scene. So let's save this, return to the Unity editor, and what I'm going to do, just to show that this is working, is I'm going to take my data out of my streaming assets folder temporarily and play the scene, and we'll see that we get our error, cannot load game data. And if we start, we just get question text and blank time and score, right? So the game is seriously broken. And now if we drop our data back into streaming assets where it can find it at that path and play our scene, no more error. And we can see that now we're loading the data from the file. We can say frogs eat pizza and mice live on the moon. And so now we're able to load our data from our text file, from our JSON file. The next thing that we're going to want to do in the next section is to write an editor script which will allow us to edit that data here in Unity. Before we move on to that, I'm going to take a look at the chat and see how you guys are doing. Take some questions. So the question is, why use JSON over scriptable objects? For one, scriptable objects are not designed to be written to at runtime. They're much better as data containers that we read from as opposed to data containers that we write to. And also, so you remember I mentioned the streaming assets folder. Well, the streaming assets folder is when we build our binary, this data is going to persist as a separate file. So if we wanted to update this data, we could just pull this data down from the web, for example, or we could, if we wanted to push an update, we could just update this one text file as opposed to having people download the binary of our application. And so we get some benefits that way. Somebody's asking to leave the code up while talking. I sure can. This is load game data. That's the last thing that we wrote. So hopefully that helps. So the point of the JSON here is being able to write it to a text file and read it again, and it also remains human readable, right? So if we wanted to just open it up and change some of our answers or change the point values, we don't even actually have to have a copy of Unity. We can just open the JSON file and change the values.